I view it as a huge opportunity. I mean, why should we be limited by talent that's within the radius of our corporate HQ or even within the borders of our country, when we can find amazing people all across the world with different skills and perspectives. And I think that also brings kind of a wild card to the table in a positive way, which is diversity. We end up with a lot more opinions, insights, broader perspective, as I said, that wouldn't have been afforded to us had we been limited by constraints of physical proximity.
Welcome, everyone, to the 1% Edge podcast, where we have the privilege of meeting amazing guests and having conversations about their journeys of getting 1% better every day. Today's hot topic: hiring and developing top talent in today's environment, including dealing with remote work and international hires. And to help us out with that, we have the honor of having Patrick MacKelvie. Did I say that right?
Yes, sir.
Vice President of Sales and Go-to-Market at Remote. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Carlos. Excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you. So how about this? Let's start out with, think of it like a process. What do you see as some of the top issues in hiring top talent, especially given today's environment? And, even the idea of hiring people in different states that you might be incorporated in or doing business in, or even different countries.
Yeah, you bet. It's kind of the blessing and challenge of remote work, right? The broader we get, the more distributed we get. I think it exposes you to a lot of talent that historically would not have been necessarily on your radar. People that weren't looking for you, or people that you weren't necessarily looking for. But it's also challenging, right? We're more dispersed, more fragmented than we've ever been. So I think there's an inherent challenge that, is coupled with the opportunity. But I think technology is a beautiful thing. And at Remote, we deal with a lot of this in the services we provide and the product we sell. But as a leader of teams, it's always paramount to me that I want to find the best people regardless of location, right? And, make sure from a cost perspective, but overall, from my perspective, it's a talent perspective, and make sure we have the best people we can in seat. So yeah, I think with that comes a lot of nuance, time zones, language. There's obviously a lot of international laws, regulations, kind of employment things that we have to consider in that. But I view it as a huge opportunity. I mean, why should we be limited by talent that's within the radius of our corporate HQ or even within the borders of our country, when we can find amazing people all across the world with different skills and perspectives? And I think that also brings kind of a wild card to the table in a positive way, which is diversity. We end up with a lot more opinions, insights, broader perspective, as I said, that wouldn't have been afforded to us had we been limited by constraints of physical proximity.
All right, I agree with you, but I think about across my multiple businesses, and I go, one of the challenges I always think about is, well, how do I trust the person I'm hiring, especially in different countries? How do I know that they have the right background, or how do you get over that hump of being confident that the person you are hiring has the right skills, the right environment, the right education, whatever that is?
Yeah. I mean, there's certain validation that you can put in place, employment screenings and all that. But I think a lot of it is predicated on networks and people that and trust. Certainly companies that are out there that have great reputations. And I think the world is moving this way, right? So we're getting better at sort of vetting those things, and people are becoming more open to hiring someone that you've maybe never met, which is the case at Remote a lot of times. I mean, as the name of the company suggests, right, we were set up from our inception as a company that was entirely remote, no physical offices, right? And there's situations where we can work alongside folks for weeks or months or years without ever meeting in person, which is
Right.
pretty wild. And I think if you would have put us in a time machine and go back 10 years or something, that would have been situation at least unheard of. Certainly there were companies at the forefront of doing this, but we've shifted. I think is a lot, and it's kind of one of I talk about it as sort of a silver lining of COVID, which was obviously a horrible experience for all of us, in different ways, impacted us in different ways, but. it's in a lot of ways stripped down some barriers. All of a sudden, you had top talent, and we, had this in our own organization. I wasn't with remote at the time, but in my former life, where people were moving, right? We all went async and remote largely, and folks were moving to different parts of the country, different corners of the globe. Getting a little further off the grid, those sorts of
Right.
things. And so we had to deal with this as people managers and leaders to say, hey, I don't want to lose this person. They're a quality contributor, maybe somebody who's borderline irreplaceable. And how do I accommodate my own practices, or how do we, as a leadership team, as a company, realign on these things to accommodate them? Because we need to become more flexible if we want to continue to be an employer of choice and keep these folks in the boat.
All right. So hopefully I don't lose my audience, but one little detail question. So I know like even hiring across different states, you got to be doing business in that state and you got to make sure you know employment law for that state. I'm assuming even hiring in different countries makes it even higher. And we're not talking about 1099 employees. We're talking about actual company employees. Any advice how you deal with that complexity?
Yeah, for sure. And that's kind of why this whole employer of record business exists, right? It can be very expensive and very risky to go hire, especially internationally. Every country has its own employment laws, their own sort of tax protocols, their own benefits requirements, and those there's some overlap for sure, but a lot of those are unique. And so without understanding what those are, you can inadvertently expose your company and yourself to a tremendous amount of risk. And so EORs were basically spun up to deal with that, where the EOR provider, remote is one, obviously, but they established the local entities and ultimately employ experts to essentially keep you compliant and eliminate that risk. So you're basically doing it by proxy. As labor, I guess, just generally, I don't know what, for a better blanket term, as labor diversifies, there are lots of different ways to classify work. So you can have contractors, obviously, like professional employment organizations, PEOs are big here in the United States and other countries. So there are lots of different ways that businesses may want to do that because it's advantageous to them from a tax or a risk perspective. But yeah, the compliance is king, right? And at the end of the day, for the employee as well, they don't want to get their tax withholdings messed up or something like that,
Right.
or their payroll messed up. So it's important to make sure that you manage those really tightly. And even talking to some of the largest companies in the world, they still have issues with this, even though they've got enough money and maybe entities established in dozens of countries and armies of lawyers and tax people and all that sort of thing. But even that can be really hard to manage. So it's a real challenge. I mean, the whole category, the EOR employer record category, exists for that reason. And yeah, there are folks out there like us that are helping keep organizations compliant. But it goes back to the last question you have too, because what's really driving that? Sometimes it's cost. You want to hire folks at a lower wage or more economical rate than maybe you could in your primary country of operation. But a lot of times it's just the best talent. We saw this a lot in the software space, and I've spent my whole career in software as a service and SaaS. But you would have these big engineering pods, and you look at India as probably the biggest example, where there's a ton of skilled labor and more all the time, and super quality folks. So how do you expand to basically take advantage of the talent that exists, outside of, in our case, the United States, but any central country of a company's operation.
Yeah. As part of this podcast, I had set up a website. So I went, researched, went with this top rated company out there. And my project manager is out of India and he is amazing. I mean, I thank him every day. He keeps my butt on track. And is there similar talent here in the States? Of course there is. But I mean, he is just as good as anything we got in the States. And I'm assuming comes at a little bit different cost structure. And he works around the time zones, and he's a great asset to that company because the impression I get of the company I hired is really through their employees. So you want to be represented well. Speaking of which, now let's say we've hired him. How do you create that culture that you want for your organization when you have a remote workforce that maybe hasn't seen they don't see anybody face to face?
Yeah. I mean, engagement is so key, right? So I think it starts by having a strong culture, kind of having cultural roots, and who your organization is, and that's true whether you're face to face or async or some kind of hybrid situation. And also the leadership and making sure folks are on board with this. I mean, with international work or whatever it might be, it probably transcends any kind of sort of cultural construct you want to put out there. But making sure you've got a strong leadership team who is, investing in their people, and that doesn't necessarily have to exist face to face, right? I've been remotely based for 20 years. I say I was doing remote before remote was cool, and it's a challenge for everybody. But it comes down to, I think, core tenets that remain, whether you're face to face, remote, or hybrid, which are just engagement and communication. It doesn't sound, there's not a lot of sizzle in that, but I think it's super important to make sure that you're finding different ways to engage people and speaking to them in ways that that motivate them, because we're all structured a little differently and we're all motivated differently. I think about it like love languages, talking with my wife, right? Like it's important to understand what resonates with folks, and that transcends environments. Again, whether you're in person or fully remote or hybrid. Um, I think a lot of it too, and I have to give credit to the founders at Remote, because we've obviously done this in an extreme way. I mean, the whole company was set up to be remote from inception, and largely async, which they're both software engineers by trade. And I think async works if you can literally work around the clock and kind of project based work of any sort. On my side, on the sales and go-to-market side, we're obviously working with prospects and customers and folks where we need to be online when they're online. So async is maybe a little asterisk. We're like aspiringly async, but the documentation is really important too. I think you have to put really strong emphasis on single sources of truth from a policy perspective, but also our enablement team takes on an even more critical role. I mean, I'd argue that training and development of folks is important regardless of context or physical proximity. But for us, it's crucial. If we fall down in some of those areas, it can really set us back, temporarily, or maybe even start to kind of sow seeds that um, begin to kind of expose themselves down the line, where we realize, wow, there's something we really missed here, and we may not figure it out for weeks or months or something like that, and that can have a very material impact on our trajectory moving forward, whether it's a project-based construct or something that's maybe bigger, like team or company wide.
Well, Patrick, like yourself, I think back through my career, and yes, I had an office, especially early on, but I always traveled. So, and then as I got into leadership, the team I managed wasn't local; it was all over the place. And so, two little tidbits I kind of got along the way. One is when I had about 250 people worldwide in a worldwide role, I made an effort to make sure I visited every region at least once a year. So, Patrick, if you and I get to break bread and have a conversation, hey, a month from now, 6 months from now, when we're over Zoom or Teams or whatever, I know you, right? We gotten to meet each other, so we created a little bit of bond that I think pays dividends later on. The other little aspect of it is really putting in the time, like you mentioned, communication and effort into talking to your folks. So, for example, I have a good friend who has an international team, and part of his team's in India. In fact, they're kind of spread all over the place. I mean, he gets up at night and has calls during their day just as much as they get up sometimes at night, their time, and have calls his day. And he tries to balance it out. But they try to, use Teams or Zooms or whatever to really try to look each other in the eye and work through so you don't have miscommunications along the way and really create a bond with each other. And I think it just takes a little extra effort.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. You have to be more deliberate, is how I would summarize that. I think you said it very well, though. And think through those things a little bit more in advance. I was a ski racer growing up, and when you're skiing like the slalom, they always tell you, if you're looking at the gate that you're about to turn around right in front of you, you're late. You'll get late, and maybe blow out of the race course or something like that. And I think a lot of it is part and parcel with communication. We have to be thinking a couple steps ahead in order to make sure that we're checking all those boxes. And it's not perfect. I mean, we make mistakes. I make mistakes for sure. But it's all learning all the time, right? You want to continue to adapt process. And something you said too about getting together, I get that question a lot. Just the name of our company, and obviously the way we operate. Like, do you see each other? And I think it makes those opportunities. Number one, I think it's very important that you still find time to get together physically, because, as you said, there's no substitute from sitting across the table from someone and having a coffee or a sandwich or a beer or whatever that might entail. and you build community that way, but it makes those times even more important. And I think, we're very focused when we approach those things because we don't get together a ton. That time is, it's kind of coveted, honestly, and
Right.
people look forward to it, and it is really important. From a manager, sort of subordinate perspective, or however you want to think about that, but just as teams of people. I mean, we're all relational beings as humans, right? And even the most, sort of, reclusive types, I think can benefit from that to some degree. And it's good. I mean, we prioritize the flexibility. It's really important to our employees and our culture as a company that, hey, you can live where you want, and in some cases, more async roles, certainly you can work when you want. But those points of connection become all the more important because they are a little bit more rare.
All right. So speaking about some folks being more, what's the right word I should use here? More willing to have interaction face to face, and some folks not. Especially sometimes you think about younger generations like millennials and Gen Zers. They're used to, hey, I just text somebody. I don't have to have these conversations with folks. How do you deal with creating that bond, that culture across generations? Because we got more generations in the workforce today than ever before, I hear.
Yeah, it's true. A lot of it I think is, I don't know how well this scales, right? You have to put in the work to something you were alluding to earlier, but I think it's important to check in with people and have honest conversations about how they like to be, managed, or just how they like to work. It's super important to check in with folks and understand what motivates them, the things that they're focused on from a development perspective, all those sorts of things. But I think it often gets overlooked, like how people choose to communicate. And we live in a time where, we have unprecedented amounts of tools. Like we're huge users of Slack, which is, for anybody who uses it, it's a tool with tremendous utility. However, it also has the opportunity to be very noisy and distracting. If you read, any productivity book, they're going to talk to you about email, and I think, messaging apps like Slack, and how you should turn those off. For us, it's a crucial component of how we work together. So I think it's, sometimes it's just different modalities of communication, and making sure that, there's expectations from a company level about a certain degree of those things that you need to adopt, essentially, and sort of, adapt your own process to. But the company can also lean in, and especially as a leader, I think we can lean in. Some folks crave a little bit more, personal interaction, one-on-one time. Others work better in team meetings, and then, obviously being able to get together every so often. I think especially in sales and go-to-market roles, we're people. So there's no substitute for that. But it's balance at the end of the day. And I also wouldn't make assumptions on, and I don't say this critically, but I just because I've made these mistakes or missteps, to make assumptions that, all Gen Zers like to be communicated with this way, and
Agreed.
all,
Yeah.
all millennials like to be communicated with this way. It's important to check in with the individual and not just, put folks in certain buckets, because you will find situations that surprise you. Another thing that I focus on, and really try to instill in my leadership teams as well, is having those open conversations, kind of creating safe space, for folks to voice their preferences. I think a lot of times the questions go unasked, and so you're unintentionally, but you're missing things for folks that are really important to them. It goes back to the love language thing, right? We need to understand
Yep.
ultimately what makes people tick, how to engage them and ultimately motivate them.
Yeah. One of the things, and I think I did it unconsciously at first, is if you get teams working on a project, right? Like, hey, we're going to have a project and these folks are going to come together, and you create some parameters around that, and not micromanage it, but just really, how are we going to get this project done? They create kind of that bond because they go through something together and they find a way around it. So when I did it unconsciously before, like it wasn't my intention that it helped create culture, but I look back and by having this group of people that I kind of cross functionally put together, no matter where they're at, it creates this bond with folks, because you come out the other end, success, either successfully got through the project or we didn't. And we shared something. And now, hey, I know how you work. You know how I work. I'm looking forward to the next project that we get to do on, right?
For sure. Yeah, I actually just reread this book. It's a great one. I'm not no sponsored, no affiliation or anything like that, but it's a book by Liz Wiseman called Multipliers. I think a lot of managers have read the book, and she was at Oracle for many years, like running L&D programs. It just has an amazing perspective on kind of that journey and some of the things she learned and then put into practice. But she talks about that a lot, empowering folks in different ways to take on more, and obviously putting them in situations to be successful. You don't just kind of hand them the keys to the Cadillac and say, go have fun. But there's an awesome opportunity to find strengths in people that maybe you didn't observe, because you're putting them in places where, you're hedging your bets a little bit, of course, but putting them in positions where they can, punch above their weight a little bit and take on more. And it starts with hiring good people, going back to a question, you asked 10 minutes ago. But it's also our responsibility as leaders to put them in places to succeed, right? And that benefits the individual, but it also has a potentially massive impact on the team. You're finding strengths and abilities in folks that maybe you didn't exist and or didn't know existed, and things you can leverage down the road. So it's great for the individual to engage and develop themselves, but it's on us to put them in those positions and make sure that we're giving opportunity where opportunities due. And there's a tremendous benefit to teams, organizations, and companies that you can realize by making. I think it's a pretty small philosophical shift.
Agreed. All right. So we talked about hiring. We talked about creating this culture in this remote workforce environment. What about developing individuals, right? You think back about how do you help individuals, like you just said, get exposure beyond their current situation and develop as a professional.
Yeah, great question. I once upon a time started my career going down the path of becoming a teacher, and I think there's so much in that process and the exposure I had, doing some classroom teaching work, and a lot of like mentoring and coaching and those sorts of things that directly apply to leadership, in whatever capacity, and certainly see that a lot in the business world. I think a lot of it, first and foremost, comes back to understanding what people's motivations are. So I always encourage my teams, individuals, managers that work in my organization, to have those conversations with folks and find out what truly motivates them. There's tremendous power in asking someone like, "Hey, what is your trajectory?" And having an honest conversation and listening, right? And then asking how you can help. And obviously, not everyone is qualified for, or ready for that next step or that next role, but it creates a safe environment, and I think kind of an open environment where you can talk about these things and actively work on developing people. The other thing that I think gets sort of misunderstood and maybe not deployed correctly in a lot of organizations is we look at development as a top-down thing. Like, how do I, as a manager, put this person in a position to succeed? The reality is, like, by empowering that person to take on more, they sort of become a captain of their own destiny, right? And work on developing themselves. And I've also found, from a productivity perspective, you're going to 10x what you're going to get from that person by giving them a little bit more control over that. But it starts with the leader to create that, that culture, that environment where it's okay to have those conversations first and foremost, and then where your organization prioritizes having those conversations. I think that gets, inadvertently, unintentionally, but I think it gets missed a lot.
Yeah, one of the mistakes I made early on as a manager of people, intentionally or unintentionally, I just assumed they all wanted the same things I wanted, right? More money, more career, more position. And after I got kicked in the teeth a little bit, I sat down with each of my direct reports at the time, and I kind of talked about, where do what career path do you want? What are your challenges? Like, an example of that, when I hired all of them, I said, "Hey, this is a traveling role. I never want to hear I can't travel, or else you probably don't want to take on this job." And I remember talking to one of them, because "Hey, look, I'm not complaining about travel. I know how you feel about it. However, I got two small kids at home. And if I could have a little bit more predictability or a little bit more balance, especially these early years, I think it'll work out." And I go, "Great point." And then I have other people on the team that don't have little kids at home that are more willing to take on the work. So not only did we share it with them and me, but we also try to share it across the team so that we can help each other out.
Yeah.
So, like, we had
We
one employee. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, yeah. So we and this is something that I borrowed from somebody else. Like, probably any good idea that I have, it's not my own, but it's I think that's okay. Credit where credit's due. I wish I could name the person that I actually borrowed this from. But we have quarterly business reviews, right? Like
Hmm.
most businesses, most roles, and we started kicking those off with the presentations. And I'm talking about going in the Wayback Machine when I was a frontline manager, managing teams of salespeople. And before we get into numbers and goals and progress toward quota and all that fun stuff, we just put a really simple slide at the front of the deck that was simply asking like, "What's your why? Why do you do what you do?" So Simon Sinek, wherever you want
Yeah.
to channel that from. But it was amazing to me. I mean, exceeded any expectation I had about how much you learned about a person and their motivation by asking that one simple question. So you've got pictures of kids and things going on. You've got people that are house projects, or that they want to buy a boat or whatever it is. And from a coaching perspective, going back to that, especially when times get rough, but also when when good things are happening and we can celebrate those things. I mean, there's no greater satisfaction for me than somebody achieving their goals and knowing that you at least help put them in a position to do that. And yeah, very simple question, right? You can learn a tremendous amount by just having a really it's seemingly kind of benign sort of prompt, and yeah, aligning on those things, because ultimately, I mean, I like my job and I hope everybody on my team likes their jobs, but we have other purposes in mind, right? Things
Right.
that we're focused on, and aligning those two things can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I mean, then you're more bought in to what you're doing, right? Because it's connected, right? It's all part of a greater mission. All right, I might steal that as well.
Yeah.
All my great ideas I have stolen from others, so I'm okay with that though.
Not only do we look alike, but we're also yeah, wired the same. No, it's true, and there's greatness that goes on underneath our noses all the time. So sometimes it's just it's being curious enough to ask the question and dig in a little bit to find out what's really making somebody tick.
All right, Patrick, for our audience that want to know you a little bit, tell me a little bit about your story. You started out as a teacher. Did I get that right?
Yeah, yeah, I was on the path to becoming a classroom teacher in Oregon. I live in Portland, Oregon, and at the time in the state of Oregon, you could actually teach with a bachelor's degree for a finite amount of time, and then had to be enrolled in a master's program. So I had some debt from my undergrad and was applying to post-secondary programs, and looking at getting my master's of arts in teaching, and looking at the bills that were going to come along with that, and through a kind of a personal connection, a couple degrees removed, found out that there was this startup company that was doing curriculum-based software for education, which was obviously very much in line with my passions at the time and still. And so I took a role as basically a business development rep to make some money and save up some money for school. And yeah, ultimately never looked back. So I've been on the software journey ever since. But my goal is, my best friend is a fascinating guy. He works for the State Department. He's a diplomat, and we have conversations about hopefully retiring early or somewhat early, and maybe just going back to teach like high school pro bono, with all the life lessons and hopefully perspective that we could offer to high school kids. So someday maybe you'll reconnect with me somewhere down the line, and I'll be hanging out in a classroom working with high school kids.
Well, Patrick, it's funny because I used to always think like, hey, I work to achieve a certain amount of wealth and assets and whatever goals you got. But hey, once I get there, same thought. Hey, I think I want to be a teacher. I think I want to help others, even if it's just because I went to community college my first 2 years as a way to afford college. And I always think fondly at that time, these are people that, you know, didn't have the wealth or didn't have the ability to go to a major university. So they're getting their associates or something to get them on that journey. And I always thought I'd go back and do something like that. And it's funny because when this role came up about 16 years ago, I thought, oh, I'll do that for fun for a little bit because it'll feed my whole teaching others and helping others achieve their goals. And here I am over 16 years later, I'm still doing it.
Yeah, well, I'll share a realization with you that codified for me early on. I still think about this a lot. I mean, first of all, you don't need to be in a classroom to teach, right? I think where
Right.
there's plenty of opportunities to do that and learn. My father told me when I was a little guy, and something that I think about, I mean, daily, that you should try to learn something and teach something every day. And I feel like that's such sage advice. But Yeah, I mean, I think sales and leadership really are teaching. I mean, it really is. You're teaching and you're coaching, and I think actually a lot of teaching is sales as well because
Yeah, even clients, right? Working with them, helping them achieve their goals. If that's your
100%.
perspective of sales, I think you're much more successful than trying to bamboozle them to sell your latest whatever.
Yep, yep. Education, leading with value. It all applies in both constructs for sure. The two things are definitely more connected than they're not.
All right, a grand finale question. What might be that one piece of advice, although you've had a lot of good stuff along the way, be it business or personal, you would share with the audience that helps them get 1% better, learn something today from, for their own journey?
I get asked a lot. I do a lot of interviewing. We're growing like crazy, so I get asked by a lot of folks. They're like, what are the things, the attributes you're looking for in a sales rep or a manager or whatever it might be? And I always thought like intelligence and motivation were the two true intangibles, right? We can teach you things, we can train you, but can we really make you smarter? Maybe to some degree, we're born with the brain in our head, and hopefully it's a
Mm-hmm.
good thing. And motivation, similarly, and in sales roles, obviously, there's a lot of folks who are coin operated, but like we spoke about before, there's generally an underlying why. But where I've kind of landed more recently on this, and this has probably just been in the last 6 months or so, this occurred to me is curiosity. I mean, I feel like that, regardless of role, regardless of where you sit, sort of in the hierarchy, it's so important. And I think just as students, as a student of life, it's important to always remain curious. So channeling my inner Ted Lasso there, I think it's just to remain curious. And when you stop, when you find yourself in a role or on a project or a team or in any kind of function where you don't have the ability to be curious or things are boring, I think that's time to kind of poke your head up and start looking around for something else. I also find it super important in coaching conversations, right? Making sure that folks are challenged and they have the opportunity to be curious and know that the company supports that the team supports that the leader supports that, and to ask those questions. I think that for me is seminal.
Yeah, I, I do a lot of things well. I always think hiring is not my greatest skill set because I believe in people and I want to see the best in them. And part of the things I used to say that I can't, I, I can't teach you attitude, which kind of goes back to that curiosity thing. If you don't want to get better and you don't want to be a part of a team and you don't, want to succeed and grow something together as a team, I can't teach you that, right? That's a will thing that's either in you or not. And sometimes over the years, I've tried different questions to try to pull that out of folks. But usually it's just, hey, do they have a track record of doing something just like that or not?
Yep, yep, for sure.
All right. Hey, if people want to know more about Patrick, remote, heck, you said you're hiring, so maybe they want to reach out to you for that. What's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, always looking for great people. LinkedIn's probably the most convenient. You can find me on there. Remote.com is us, remote.com/jobs or careers. And we do a lot of facilitation too, I think largely because of the name of our company, we got a lot of people reaching out to us saying like, hey, I want a remote job, so we actually have some pretty robust, they're essentially job boards on our website where folks can go and post their profiles. And we have something, I think we're approaching like 1 million different profiles, and it's free. You can go on and post those, and we just sort of serve as it's our community service, right? As a clearinghouse to help people who are looking for
That's,
remote work in lots of different capacities find it. So that's a good place to start as well.
I think it's awesome. Patrick, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Carlos. Thanks for having me. It's been awesome.
Awesome. All right, folks, that does it for this week's episode. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform that you love. And until next time, I wish you nothing but the best success. Thanks, Patrick.